Let's go ahead now and take a look at a few examples of tight areas on Amazon's weekly chart. Here we're looking at a chart starting April 2016 going out till the beginning of October 2018. I've marked up a few charts here. This one is weekly, and what I've done so we can hone in on a few areas in more detail is I've marked up corresponding areas on daily charts. I've also got some areas marked on here that I don't have marked on the daily charts because and that's the point. You want to be looking at both, because sometimes you'll see tight areas show up on a weekly that don't necessarily catch your eye on a daily, and vice versa. You'll see some areas on a daily chart tighten up that are short. For example, your eye may pick up a week to a week and a half of tight action, whereas that's not really going to stand out on a weekly chart. So you may see some areas that don't correspond from daily to weekly, and that's just because they don't really. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the first area I've got marked right here. Here you've got a nice 3 weeks tight. You could call it 4, as we drift into the stock's 40-week line, which is the equivalent to its 200-day moving average. You can see volume remains below average the entire time, and for the most part declines over the course of these few weeks. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next area I have marked here, just a little bit higher, closer to prior highs. We can see this get super tight, and again we drift into the stock's 10-week moving average, which corresponds to its 50-day moving average on the daily chart. And here again, volume declines and remains well below average. You can see volume eventually comes in on the upside, and we get a solid move higher before we start to move sideways again. And I don't have it circled. This isn't necessarily tight action here, but you'll see after the stock puts in a high and stalls out a bit, we do drift in a somewhat organized manner as volume declines to below average again. Now this action here is going to look a whole lot choppier on a daily chart. I don't have it marked in either. I'm just pointing it out as we move along. So let's go ahead now and take a look at the corresponding daily chart at these areas. Here is the corresponding daily chart to the first section of Amazon's weekly chart that we just got done looking at. And as I said, some areas will be marked on here that are not marked on the weekly, and vice versa. So on the weekly chart, we saw a few weeks of tight action down here as the stock was approaching a 200-day moving average on the weekly chart. Again, that was its 40-week moving average. It's a little bit harder to see. You can see it tighten up here on a relative basis after all of this. However, it does break a little bit lower. This doesn't show up to the eye as clean and tight, let's say, as this first area marked here, which comes after a solid move higher. But anyway, again, on the weekly, it does show up as 3, maybe 4 weeks tight here before this move. We've got clearly tight action as we move sideways along the stock's short-term moving averages. We see here we get a little shakeout below, but we're quickly picked up by the stock's 50-day. And again, we've got the corresponding below average volume down here. I should have it marked and don't, but I think it's clear to see we've got much lower volume than we had on the move up, and well below average, which is exactly what we want to see before volume comes back in on the upside and takes the stock to new highs. Now, again, this area marked here on the daily chart, we can see after this explosive move higher, we get the stock whips around in a volatile manner, ultimately only breaking its 10-day for a couple of days, never even touching its 21-day or 23 exponential moving average before it starts to tighten up again. Volume declines, and we've got the big volume explosion back out of that area again after we tighten up on lighter volume. We did not have this area marked on the weekly, and that's because, again, it's, what do we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got about a week and a half here, so a week and a half of tight action is not going to show up or stand out on a weekly chart. Let's go ahead back to that weekly chart now and look at the next couple of tight areas and then the daily from thereafter. Here we are back to Amazon's weekly chart, and we're going to take a look at its next area of tight action here, which is this area. We've got marked once again corresponding to below average and declining volume, which is exactly what you want to see as the stock tightens up. And again, Amazon trades in a very tight and organized manner once it decides to tighten up and get going. As you can see here, it has a solid respect for its 10-week moving average, or which is the same as its 50-day moving average here. We've got nice tight action as volume dries up and comes in well below average, and then we can see volume picks up above average again as the stock breaks out to new highs and starts trending higher again. Let's go ahead and take a look at this now at the corresponding areas on Amazon's daily chart. Okay, so we're back to Amazon's corresponding daily chart for the areas we just discussed on its weekly. You'll see here I have marked a tight area that I did not have marked on its weekly chart, and the reason being here, and it clearly fits the bill, this is tight action. Volume is well below average here. However, we've got slight wedging up along the lows, which ultimately is seen as a flaw in areas like that. This is very subtle, however. Regardless, even if you were to decide to participate at this level and buy here, you just have to deal with a little frustration. The stock comes out. It's always easy to say in retrospect after it pulled back also that there was a slight flaw here, and that's why it had to come back and retest this level and its moving average. Regardless, this is a constructive retest, and it doesn't really matter whether you figured that out or not. Again, it's always easy hindsight too. So while this is tight price action and volume is clearly below average as it consolidates here, we've got a slight wedge up along the lows, which could be seen as a flaw. Also on its weekly chart, it's easier to see this little bit of a wedge up on light volume before it goes. And in this case, and obviously we're talking in hindsight here, the stock actually does retrace all of the breakout from that area, retest these levels, shake out below its 21 and 21-day moving average, simple 23 exponential moving average, and ultimately tighten up and go again. Now, this in and of its, again, on the daily chart, may not catch your eye as tight, certainly constructive here as we're moving sideways on overall very light and well below average volume before the volume comes in taking it higher. But if you remember on its weekly chart, let's go back to the weekly, which is right here. So here is what I was referring to as wedging up along the lows, and here it is. Here would be your wedge on light volume. That can be seen as a flaw. Once again, here where on the daily chart it looked significantly more wide and loose and choppy, the weekly does a great job of cleaning it up. You can see how tight it is on a closing basis, and you can really see volume dry up here. So we've got a few areas of tight action marked here, and I simply just marked it because this is it's another example of Amazon's organized, solid stair-step pattern, respecting its 10-week moving average and just marching along constructively to highs, not to mention it's an extremely liquid big leader with enormous earnings. Let's go ahead and take another quick look. So as we move, again, one more area I wanted to point out as we move back to Amazon's daily chart here. This area here is how many closes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is 1 week of action. It's impossible to see a tight week in and of itself on a weekly chart, so this is another area here. If you were sitting in front of your screen every day and watching this tighten up at its 10-day moving average on light volume, that might be spot where you'd add on some shares with, assuming you get in always at an optimal price with a tight logical stop. This is an ideal spot to try and add maybe a third or a quarter of a position, and as they say, trading around your core, which you never want to average up too far. So again, this is a tight area that's really only going to stand out on a daily chart because you can't see 1 week tighten up on the weekly. It's only one bar of data. As you can see, going through just a couple of years of data on Amazon's daily and weekly charts, it's very important to take a look at both. Again, as we discussed before we got started, tight areas on a weekly are not necessarily going to show up on its daily chart, and areas that are going to catch your eye on the daily chart as tight will certainly not show up on the weekly chart, especially if it's only a week or two of data.